A nun, a countryman, and a blacksmith were once wandering through the world together. One day they lost their way in a thick forest, and they were thankful when they saw in the distance the walls of a house where they hoped they might obtain refuge for the night. When they got close to the house, they saw it was an old castle, mainly in ruins, but some rooms were still habitable. As they were homeless, they determined to take up their abode into this castle, and they arranged that one of them should stay home at day, and the other two would go out to seek their fortune and return at night. The lot of remaining at home first fell to the nun, and when the countryman and the blacksmith had gone out into the world, she set to work and tidied up the house and prepared all the food for the day. As her companions did not come home for the midday meal, she sat down and ate by herself, and then she put the rest in an oven to keep it warm. Just as she was sitting down to sew, the door opened, and a little gray man walked in. Standing before her, he said, "Oh, how cold I am!" The nun felt very sorry for him. "Please sit down by the fire and warm yourself," she said. The little man did as he was told, and soon called out, "Oh, how hungry I am!" And the nun answered, "There is food in the oven. Help yourself." Well, the little man did not need to be told twice. He set to work and he ate up everything with the greatest possible speed. When the nun saw this, she was very angry, and she scolded the dwarf because he was so greedy and he had left nothing for her companions. The little man resented her words, and he threw her against this wall and then that, and when he left her. And as he walked out of the house, the little man resented these words, and he beat her, and he threw her against one wall and another. When he was done, he left her lying on the floor, and he marched out of the house. In the evening, the countryman and the blacksmith returned home, and when they found out, on demanding their dinner, that there was none, they reproached the nun bitterly. They refused to believe her when she tried to tell them what had happened. The next day, the countryman asked to be left in charge of the house, and he promised that if he was there when they came home at night, they would have supper. So the other two went out into the forest, and the countryman, having prepared the food for the day, ate his own portion, put the rest in the oven, and sat down to rest. In came the little gray man, though he wasn't invited, and this time he had 2 heads. He shook and he trembled as before, and he said, "Oh, how cold I am!" The countryman, who was frightened out of his wits, begged him to draw near the fire and warm himself. Soon after that, the dwarf greedily looked around and said, "Oh, how hungry I am!" "There is food in the oven, so you can eat," replied the nervous countryman. Then the little man fell to with both his heads and soon finished the entire dinner. When the countryman scolded him for his greedy eating habits, he treated him exactly as he had the nun, and he left the poor fellow more dead than alive. Now when the blacksmith came home with the nun in the evening and found nothing for supper, he flew into a rage, and he swore that he would stay at home the following day, and no one should go supperless that night. When the day dawned, the countryman and the nun set out into the wood, and the blacksmith prepared the food for the day as the others had. Again the gray dwarf appeared at the house without an invitation, and this time he had 3 heads. When he complained he was cold, the blacksmith asked him to sit near the fire. And when he said he was hungry, the blacksmith put some food on a plate and gave it to him. The dwarf greedily and quickly gobbled it up with his 3 heads, and when he was finished he started looking around with his 6 eyes, and he demanded more. When the blacksmith refused to give him any more, he flew into a terrible rage, and he proceeded to treat him in the same way as he had treated his companions. But the blacksmith was a match for him, and he seized a huge hammer and he struck off 2 of the dwarf's heads. The little man yelled with pain and rage and hastily fled from the house. The blacksmith ran after him and pursued him a long way, but at last they came to an iron door, and through the door the little creature vanished. The door shut behind him, and the blacksmith could not get through. He gave up the pursuit and went home. He found that the nun and the countryman had come home in the meantime, and they were very delighted when he placed some supper before them and showed them the 2 heads he had struck off with his hammer, which I hope he did after they finished eating. The 3 companions determined there and then to free themselves from this gray dwarf, and the very next day they set off to find him. They had to walk a long way and to search for many hours before they found the iron door through which the dwarf had disappeared. And when they found it, they had the greatest trouble in getting it open. When at last they succeeded in forcing it open, they entered a large hall, and what should they see but a young and beautiful girl working at a table. The moment she saw the blacksmith, the nun, and the countryman, she fell at their feet, thanking them with tears in her eyes for saving her. She had been under the power of a wicked magician and held captive, and she was actually a king's daughter. The day before, just about noon, she had suddenly felt the magic power over her disappear, and ever since that moment she had eagerly awaited the arrival of her deliverers. She went on to tell them that there was another princess shut up in the castle, who also was under the power of the magician. They wandered through many halls and rooms till at last they found the second princess, who was just as grateful as the first had been, and she thanked the 3 companions for saving her. Then the princesses told their rescuers that a great treasure lay hidden in the cellars of the castle, but that it was carefully guarded by a fierce and terrible dog. Completely undaunted, they all went down at once, and they found the fierce animal standing guard over the treasure, just as the princesses had said. But one blow from the blacksmith's hammer soon made an end of him, and they found themselves in a vaulted chamber full of gold and precious stones. Beside the treasure stood a tall, young, and handsome man, who advanced to meet them and thanked the nun, the blacksmith, and the countryman for having freed him from the spell he was under. He told them that he was a prince who had been banished to this castle by a wicked magician, and that he had been changed into the 3-headed dwarf. When he lost 2 of his heads, the power over the princesses had been removed, and when the blacksmith had killed the horrible dog, then he too had been set free. To show his gratitude, he begged the 3 companions to divide the treasury between them, which they did, but there was so much of it that it took a very long time. The princesses, too, were so grateful to their rescuers that one married the blacksmith and the other married the countryman. And then the prince claimed the nun as his bride, and they all lived happily together until they died.